Hey, it's Jordan with Studio GBK, and in this video I take this simple piece of walnut that I got for 25 bucks or so and turn it into a live edge chessboard like you see here, and we're also going to see how much I can sell it for, so stay tuned for that. Here we go. About 26 years ago I helped my uncle wash his car, and with the $5 that I made I went and bought my first chessboard. He also gave me free chess lessons as well, which actually turned out to be lifelong chess lessons because we're still playing and he still beats me to this day. Now, a standard chessboard is 8 by 8, which means 64 squares total. 32 of these will be wooden, so as you can see I started by cutting out these squares at the same thickness as the slab. The slab was 1.5 inches, so I actually cut these at 1 inch and 9/16 to leave room for sanding it down. Now, accuracy is key here, so as you can see, I clamped a piece of wood to my chop saw so that all 32 of my wooden squares come out to the same height. Walnut is a hardwood, and so I recommend cutting it nice and slow. I did go a bit too fast with this cut right here, which caused it to burn and split, which isn't what I wanted, but luckily I had enough wood to spare. Once these were cut, I flipped each one of them to reveal the interior grain, which is probably not the textbook word for this, but the design on these was super cool. A wise person once said it's not about what's on the outside, it's about what's on the inside, and that definitely is true with walnut. I looked at each one of these squares and picked the best 32 I could find to make this board as stunning as possible. And after that, I was ready to build the mold. I used a tape measure and a square to mark some lines on this MDF board exactly where I need them, and came back with my jigsaw to cut it all out. Size does matter when you're trying to make a perfect chessboard, so I recommend using a fine tip marker or pencil when laying this out. Given that my squares are about 1.5 inches, that multiplied by 8 means my board will be 12 inches wide in theory. The MDF board is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I cut the sides to 3 inches just to be safe. Now, here comes the technical part, getting that perfect chessboard pattern. I basically measured and made several crow's feet, as they call them, and marked a straight line through all of them. This is my center line. Then off of that, I was able to measure an equal distance to the left and right of that line and marked my edge lines. I used the actual walnut squares that this will be made of to make the most accurate lines that I possibly could, and then basically just connected all of these lines to make this as accurate as possible. Then I covered the bottom and sides of this mold with red tuck tape, which stops the epoxy from binding to the MDF board. Those of you who watched my last video know how tragic it is when epoxy binds to everything that it's not supposed to. It's all bad. Luckily, this tape is clear enough that it still allowed me to see my grid lines. I highly recommend double checking your measurements before cutting unless you want a checkers board instead. Not that there's anything wrong with checkers, but let's just be honest, chess is just checkers with a college degree. I shot some clear silicone caulking along the edges of this mold and proceeded to screw this thing together with drywall screws, which are the duct tape of woodworking. I highly recommend pre-drilling to prevent the wood from splitting on you, and also cleaning up that extra silicone that oozes out. After giving that some time to dry, I came back and stuck each one of the 32 walnut squares exactly where they're supposed to go using some hot glue, and this is to hold them in place and stop them from moving when I pour the epoxy. Now it's time to add this beautiful slab of walnut. I wanted something with a nice rich grain, tons of character, and of course a live edge. The goal here is to make this chessboard look like nature and strategy had a baby together. I got 3 of these slabs several years ago for a nice price on Facebook Marketplace, and the other 2 turned into some super cool projects, including live edge tables and mirrors. So this is a batch of wood that I know I can trust to make a super cool project. I just used my square to make some straight lines and then cut this exactly to the width of the board. Looking back on it, I wish I'd made it bigger to leave more room for error in sanding, but you live and you learn. I cut it straight down the middle with my skill saw and finished this off by hand with the hand saw, then sanded this whole thing on every side to remove all the bark, saw blade burns, lines, and rough spots that I don't want. The issue I ran into was that these live edge halves weren't perfectly square, so I actually made another line and cut these perfectly square with my chop saw. You're really supposed to do this with a table saw, but mine is out of commission right now, so I just worked with what I had, and this actually worked out pretty well. After dropping these live edges into the mold, I sealed the whole thing with this deep pore super clear epoxy, which is the same thing I'll be using for the epoxy squares. I really wasn't sure what color to go with, so I asked my followers what they thought, and the majority of people said white. I was already leaning towards white because of this other super cool board that I saw on Instagram, but I also wanted it to be somewhat transparent. So I mixed up a bunch of liquid glass epoxy and added this white titanium high flow acrylic and mixed it all together. I dropped it into my vacuum pump and chamber to remove the bubbles, and then I started pouring the epoxy squares. Now you'll notice on these squares how there's a dark and a lighter side, and I made sure that both sides have the grain going in a uniform pattern, which made this board look much better than the previous ones that I've made. This color was more clear than I expected, so I went back and added more of that white pigment and mixed it into the epoxy. There was a little gap in the side of the live edge wood that allowed a bunch of epoxy to leak out the side where I didn't want it, so I just took hot glue to seal up that area and scooped as much epoxy out of that area as I could. Then I poured an even wider batch of epoxy into each of those squares and swirled some cool marble looking patterns into each of the squares. They looked really cool initially, but didn't actually stay once this whole thing settled. I gave that a day or two to dry and came back with a clear layer of epoxy, and this is to make it appear like you're looking down into the board and that your pieces might actually fall inside. And I plan to try a volcanic version of this soon, but I'll keep you updated on that. I torched the bubbles out as much as I could, but after letting this dry, there were still lots of them on the surface, which isn't what I want, but it's not the end of the world either because I can sand past them. I took the mold apart by removing all the screws and prying off the sides with a pry bar.
Yeah.
I was able to get it out very easily, which was super satisfying. From there, I started to sand it flat using some 80 grit Abranet sandpaper.
You can see here the bubbles, and you can see that this square and these other areas are higher. It's not all at the same height. And as I sand this down, I will get below where those bubbles are and basically get it all down to an even height.
After sanding this for quite some time, I realized that it was going to take hours and hours to sand it down below all of the low spots that I was seeing and the holes. So I went over it with a hand planer to speed up this process, which made a huge mess and didn't exactly solve my problem. Therefore, I decided to switch to my router, and I used a router sled to flatten this. A router sled is basically a poor man's CNC or a poor man's planer, and I've had bad experiences with router sleds in the past, which made me not want to do this, but it was necessary. I basically shaved off a nice thin layer from the top and the bottom of this board, which made an even bigger mess than the hand planer, but it got the job done. I sanded this again with 80 grit and moved up to 120 to get it as flat and smooth as I could. Then I switched to an 1/8 inch chamfer bit to give this board a nice and even chamfer all the way around. There were some small holes that I filled in with CA glue, but not too many. Then I came back and sanded it all the way up to 600 grit and finished this off with some mineral oil and a rag. And this project is done. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what project I should tackle next. And remember, woodworking is all about patience, precision, and sometimes pretending your mistakes were a part of the plan. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Here we go. Fucking stupid fly there. Sorry guys. A lot of bugs in my shop.